This is Chapter 8 of Following the Equator. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Following the Equator by Mark Twain, Chapter 8. A Wilderness of Islands, Two Men Without a Country, A Naturalist from New Zealand, The Fauna of Australasia, Animals, Insects, and Birds, The Ornithorhynchus, Poetry and Plagiarism. It could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctly Native American criminal class except Congress. Pudd'nhead Wilson's New Calendar. When one glances at the map, the members of the stupendous island wilderness of the Pacific seem to crowd upon each other. But no, there is no crowding, even in the center of a group, and between groups there are lonely, wide deserts of sea. Not everything is known about the islands, their peoples, and their languages. A startling reminder of this is furnished by the fact that in Fiji, 20 years ago, were living two strange and solitary beings who came from an unknown country and spoke an unknown language. They were picked up by a passing vessel many hundreds of miles from any known land, floating in the same tiny canoe in which they had been blown out to sea. When found, they were but skin and bone. No one could understand what they said, and they have never named their country, or if they have, the name does not correspond with that of any island on any chart. They are now fat and sleek, and as happy as the day is long. In the ship's log there is an entry of the latitude and longitude in which they were found, and this is probably all the clue they will ever have to their lost homes. Forbes, 2 years in Fiji. What a strange and romantic episode it is, and how one is tortured with curiosity to know whence those mysterious creatures came, those men without a country, errant waifs who cannot name their lost home, wandering children of nowhere. Indeed, the island wilderness is the very home of romance and dreams and mystery. The loneliness, the solemnity, the beauty, and the deep repose of this wilderness have a charm which is all their own for the bruised spirit of men who have fought and failed in the struggle for life in the great world, and for men who have been hunted out of the great world for crime, and for other men who love an easy and indolent existence, and for others who love a roving free life, and stir and change and adventure, and for yet others who love an easy and comfortable career of trading and money-getting, mixed with plenty of loose matrimony by purchase, divorce without trial or expense, and limitless spreeing thrown in to make life ideally perfect. We sailed again, refreshed. The most cultivated person in the ship was a young Englishman whose home was in New Zealand. He was a naturalist. His learning in his specialty was deep and thorough. His interest in his subject amounted to a passion. He had an easy gift of speech, and so when he talked about animals it was a pleasure to listen to him, and profitable too, though he was sometimes difficult to understand, because now and then he used scientific technicalities which were above the reach of some of us. They were pretty sure to be above my reach, but as he was quite willing to explain them, I always made it a point to get him to do it. I had a fair knowledge of his subject, layman's knowledge, to begin with, but it was his teachings which crystallized it into scientific form and clarity, in a word, gave it value. His special interest was the fauna of Australasia, and his knowledge of the matter was as exhaustive as it was accurate. I already knew a good deal about the rabbits in Australasia and their marvelous fecundity, but in my talks with him I found that my estimate of the great hindrance and obstruction inflicted by the rabbit pest upon traffic and travel was far short of the facts. He told me that the first pair of rabbits imported into Australasia bred so wonderfully that within 6 months rabbits were so thick in the land that people had to dig trenches through them to get from town to town. He told me a great deal about worms and the kangaroo and other coleoptera, and said he knew the history and ways of all such pachydermata. He said the kangaroo had pockets, and carried its young in them when it couldn't get apples. And he said that the emu was as big as an ostrich, and looked like one, and had an amorphous appetite, and would eat bricks. Also that the dingo was not a dingo at all, but just a wild dog, and that the only difference between a dingo and a dodo was that neither of them barked. Otherwise they were just the same. He said that the only game bird in Australia was the wombat, and the only song bird the larrikin, and that both were protected by government. The most beautiful of the native birds was the bird of paradise. Next came the two kinds of lyres, not spelt the same. He said the one kind was dying out, the other thickening up. He explained that the sundowner was not a bird, it was a man. Sundowner was merely the Australian equivalent of our word tramp. He is a loafer, a hard drinker, and a sponge. He tramps across the country in the sheep-shearing season, pretending to look for work, but he always times himself to arrive at a sheep-run just at sundown, when the day's labor ends. All he wants is whiskey and supper and bed and breakfast. He gets them, and then disappears. The naturalist spoke of the bell-bird, the creature that at short intervals all day rings out its mellow and exquisite peal from the deeps of the forest. It is the favorite and best friend of the weary and thirsty sundowner, for he knows that wherever the bell-bird is, there is water, and he goes somewhere else. The naturalist said that the oddest bird in Australasia was the laughing jackass, and the biggest the now extinct great moa. The moa stood 13 feet high, and could step over an ordinary man's head or kick his hat off, and his head too, for that matter. He said it was wingless, but a swift runner. The natives used to ride it. It could make 40 miles an hour, and keep it up for 400 miles, and come out reasonably fresh. It was still in existence when the railway was introduced into New Zealand, still in existence and carrying the mails. The railroad began with the same schedule it has now, 2 expresses a week time, 20 miles an hour. The company exterminated the moa to get the mails. Speaking of the indigenous conies and Bactrian camels, the naturalist said that the coniferous and bacteriological output of Australasia was remarkable for its many and curious departures from the accepted laws governing these species of tubercles, but that in his opinion nature's fondness for dabbling in the erratic was most notably exhibited in that curious combination of bird, fish, amphibian, burrower, crawler, quadruped, and Christian called the ornithorhynchus, grotesquest of animals, king of the animalculae of the world for versatility of character and make-up. Said he, "You can call it anything you want to, and be right. It is a fish, for it lives in the river half the time. It is a land animal, for it resides on the land half the time. It is an amphibian, since it likes both and does not know which it prefers. It is a Hibernian, for when times are dull and nothing much going on, it buries itself under the mud at the bottom of a puddle and hibernates there a couple of weeks at a time. It is a kind of duck, for it has a duck bill and 4 webbed paddles. It is a fish and quadruped together, for in the water it swims with the paddles, and on shore it paws itself across country with them. It is a kind of seal, for it has a seal's fur. It is carnivorous, herbivorous, insectivorous, and vermifuginous, for it eats fish and grass and butterflies, and in the season digs worms out of the mud and devours them. It is clearly a bird, for it lays eggs and hatches them. It is clearly a mammal, for it nurses its young. And it is manifestly a kind of Christian, for it keeps the Sabbath when there is anybody around, and when there isn't, it doesn't. It has all the tastes there are, except refined ones. It has all the habits there are, except good ones. It is a survival of the fittest. Mr. Darwin invented the theory that goes by that name, but the ornithorhynchus was the first to put it to actual experiment and prove that it could be done. Hence it should have as much of the credit as Mr. Darwin. It was never in the Ark. You will find no mention of it there. It nobly stayed out and worked the theory. Of all creatures in the world, it was the only one properly equipped for the test. The Ark was 13 months afloat, and all the globe submerged, No land visible above the flood, no vegetation, no food for a mammal to eat, nor water for a mammal to drink, for all mammal food was destroyed, and when the pure floods from heaven and the salt oceans of the earth mingled their waters and rose above the mountain tops, the result was a drink which no bird or beast of ordinary construction could use and live. But this combination was nuts for the ornithorhynchus, if I may use a term like that without offense. Its river home had always been salted by the flood tides of the sea. On the face of the Noachian deluge innumerable forest trees were floating. Upon these the ornithorhynchus voyaged in peace, voyaged from clime to clime, from hemisphere to hemisphere, in contentment and comfort, in virile interest in the constant change of scene, in humble thankfulness for its privileges, in ever-increasing enthusiasm in the development of the great theory upon whose validity it had staked its life, its fortunes, and its sacred honor, if I may use such expressions, without impropriety in connection with an episode of this nature. It lived the tranquil and luxurious life of a creature of independent means. Of things actually necessary to its existence and its happiness not a detail was wanting. When it wished to walk, it scrambled along the tree-trunk. It mused in the shade of the leaves by day, it slept in their shelter by night. When it wanted the refreshment of a swim, it had it. It ate leaves when it wanted a vegetable diet. It dug under the bark for worms and grubs. When it wanted fish, it caught them. When it wanted eggs, it laid them. If the grubs gave out in one tree, it swam to another, and as for fish, the very opulence of the supply was an embarrassment. And finally, when it was thirsty, it smacked its chops in gratitude over a blend that would have slain a crocodile. When at last, after 13 months of travel and research in all the zones, it went aground on a mountain summit, it strode ashore, saying in its heart, "Let them that come after me invent theories and dream dreams about the survival of the fittest if they like, but I am the first that has done it." This wonderful creature dates back, like the kangaroo and many other Australian hydrocephalus invertebrates, to an age long anterior to the advent of man upon the earth. They date back, indeed, to a time when a causeway hundreds of miles wide and thousands of miles long joined Australia to Africa, and the animals of the two countries were alike, and all belonged to that remote geological epoch known to science as the Old Red Grindstone Post-Plesiosaurian. Later the causeway sank under the sea. Subterranean convulsions lifted the African continent 1,000 feet higher than it was before, but Australia kept her old level. In Africa's new climate the animals necessarily began to develop and shade off into new forms and families and species, but the animals of Australia as necessarily remained stationary, and have so remained until this day. In the course of some millions of years the African ornithorhynchus developed and developed and developed, and sloughed off detail after detail of its make-up, until at last the creature became wholly disintegrated and scattered. Whenever you see a bird or a beast or a seal or an otter in Africa, you know that he is merely a sorry surviving fragment of that sublime original of whom I have been speaking, that creature which was everything in general, and nothing in particular, the opulently endowed e pluribus unum of the animal world. Such is the history of the most hoary, the most ancient, the most venerable creature that exists in the earth today, Ornithorhynchus platypus extraordinariensis, whom God preserve. When he was strongly moved, he could rise and soar like that with ease, and not only in the prose form, but in the poetical as well. He had written many pieces of poetry in his time, and these manuscripts he lent around among the passengers, and was willing to let them be copied. It seemed to me that the least technical one in the series, and the one which reached the loftiest note perhaps, was this: Invocation. Come forth from thy oozy couch, O Ornithorhynchus dear, and greet with a cordial claw the stranger that longs to hear from thy own lips the tale of thy origin all unknown, thy misplaced bone where flesh should be, and flesh where should be bone, and fishy fin where should be paw, and beaver trowel tail, and snout of beast equipped with teeth where gills ought to prevail. Come, kangaroo, the good and true, foreshortened as to legs, and body tapered like a churn, and sac marsupial effegs, and tells us why you linger here, thou relic of a vanished time, when all your friends as fossils sleep, immortalized in lime. Perhaps no poet is a conscious plagiarist, but there seems to be warrant for suspecting that there is no poet who is not at one time or another an unconscious one. The above verses are indeed beautiful, and in a way touching, but there is a haunting something about them which unavoidably suggests the sweet singer of Michigan. It can hardly be doubted that the author had read the works of that poet and been impressed by them. It is not apparent that he has borrowed from them any word or yet any phrase, but the style and swing and mastery and melody of the sweet singer, all are there. Compare this invocation with Frank Dutton, particularly stanzas 1st and 17th, and I think the reader will feel convinced that he who wrote the one had read the other. 1. Frank Dutton was as fine a lad as ever you wish to see, and he was drowned in Pine Island Lake, on earth no more will he be. His age was near 15 years, and he was a motherless boy. He was living with his grandmother when he was drowned, poor boy. 17. He was drowned on Tuesday afternoon, on Sunday he was found, and the tidings of that drowned boy was heard for miles around. His form was laid by his mother's side, beneath the cold, cold ground. His friends for him will drop a tear when they view his little mound. The Sentimental Song Book, by Mrs. Julia Moore, page 36. End of chapter 8.